David Thompson sat in his corner office on the 40th floor, staring at the stack of reports that had been keeping him awake for weeks. As the CEO of Phoenix Industries, he thought he knew everything about his company. After all, he had built it from a small startup into a billion-dollar corporation with over 5,000 employees across the country. But these numbers told a different story. Employee satisfaction scores had dropped to an all-time low of 32%. Productivity in certain departments was mysteriously declining despite record profits. Most troubling were the anonymous complaints flooding in through the company's feedback system. Workers were reporting everything from unsafe working conditions to discrimination. Yet his department heads assured him these were isolated incidents from disgruntled employees. David picked up the latest batch of complaints and read through them again. One employee wrote about being afraid to take sick days because of threats from their supervisor. Another described working in freezing temperatures because the heating system in their building had been broken for months. A third complained about being denied basic supplies needed to do their job properly. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife asking if he would make it home for dinner. He glanced at his Rolex and realized it was already 8 in the evening. This had become routine. Long days at the office, reviewing reports, attending board meetings, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Yet somehow he felt more disconnected from his company than ever before. David walked over to his floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the city below. Tiny lights flickered in office buildings where people were still working late into the night. He wondered how many of them were his employees and what they really thought about the company he had spent 15 years building. The next morning brought another troubling development. His head of human resources, Patricia Williams, knocked on his door with a grim expression. She carried a folder marked confidential and set it on his desk with obvious reluctance. "David, we need to talk about the night shift reports," Patricia said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I've been investigating some of the complaints, and there might be more truth to them than we initially thought." David opened the folder and found photographs of broken equipment, safety violations, and working conditions that looked nothing like the polished corporate environment he was familiar with. One photo showed a restroom with a ceiling leak that had apparently been ignored for months. Another revealed cleaning staff working with what appeared to be damaged equipment. "How long has this been going on?" David asked, feeling his stomach sink. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. "It's hard to say. The night shift operates pretty independently. Most of the management team leaves by 6, so there's limited oversight after hours. Some of these issues might have been developing for months or even years." David studied the photos more carefully. These weren't the gleaming offices and modern facilities featured in their company brochures. This looked like a completely different workplace. "Who took these pictures?" "One of the cleaning staff members. She submitted them anonymously along with a detailed complaint about working conditions. She's afraid to come forward officially because she needs the job. But she wanted someone to know what was really happening." That afternoon, David found himself pacing his office, unable to concentrate on the quarterly projections his team had prepared. He kept thinking about the anonymous employee who had risked her job just to document problems that his management team either didn't know about or chose to ignore. He called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. Around the polished conference table sat his vice presidents, department heads, and key managers. These were people he trusted, people who had helped build the company alongside him. "I want to discuss the employee satisfaction scores and some concerning reports about working conditions," David began, watching their faces carefully. His VP of Operations, Robert Chen, was quick to respond. "David, we've looked into those complaints extensively. You're dealing with a small group of chronic complainers who would find fault with any workplace. Our efficiency metrics are at an all-time high, and our cost management has exceeded targets for 6 consecutive quarters." The head of facilities management, Lisa Rodriguez, nodded in agreement. "The night shift has always required minimal supervision. These people know their jobs, and frankly, most of them are grateful to have employment at all. A few maintenance issues here and there are normal in any large operation." David listened to their explanations, but something didn't sit right. The disconnect between what his executives were telling him and what the anonymous report suggested was too significant to ignore. "Have any of you actually spent time with the night shift workers? Talked to them directly about their concerns?" The room fell silent for a moment. Finally, his HR director spoke up. "David, most night shift employees prefer to keep to themselves. They're focused on getting their work done and going home. Direct interaction with upper management can actually make them uncomfortable. After the meeting, David remained in the conference room alone, staring at the city lights beginning to flicker on as evening approached. 15 years ago, when Phoenix Industries was just him and 12 employees working out of a rented warehouse, he knew every worker by name. He knew their families, their struggles, their dreams. When did he lose that connection? That night, David made a decision that would have shocked his board of directors and probably violated several corporate protocols. Instead of going home to his mansion in the suburbs, he drove to one of his company's main facilities. He parked across the street and watched as the day shift employees left and the night shift workers arrived. He observed people of all ages walking into the building, carrying lunch boxes and looking tired before their shift had even begun. Some walked with obvious difficulty, suggesting physical problems that might be work-related. Others looked around nervously as if they were afraid of being watched or judged. David realized he didn't recognize a single face. Despite the fact that some of these people had probably worked for his company for years, they were invisible to him, hidden behind statistics and reports and management layers that kept him insulated from the reality of their daily experience. Over the next few days, David couldn't shake what he had witnessed. He found himself making excuses to visit different company facilities at odd hours, trying to catch glimpses of how the business operated when he wasn't expected to be there. What he saw troubled him more each time. Finally, David made a decision that even he recognized as crazy. He was going to go undercover as a night shift cleaner for 2 weeks. He would create a fake identity, undergo basic training, and see his company from the perspective of its most overlooked employees. He knew it was risky. If discovered, it could create a scandal that might damage the company's reputation and his own credibility as a leader. His board of directors would probably try to have him removed if they found out. But David also knew that he couldn't continue making decisions about thousands of employees' lives based on sanitized reports and statistics. The next morning, David called Patricia into his office and swore her to absolute secrecy before explaining his plan. Her initial reaction was exactly what he expected. "David, this is insane. You could get hurt. You could get sued. The board would lose their minds if they found out. What if someone recognizes you?" But David had already thought through the logistics. He would tell his management team he was taking a 2-week vacation in Europe, something he had done before. Patricia would help create a fake identity and employment record. He would work the night shift at a facility across town where fewer people might recognize him. "I need to know the truth," David told her. "Not the version that gets filtered through 6 layers of management, but the real truth about what it's like to work for this company. These people deserve better than having their concerns dismissed or ignored." Patricia finally agreed to help, though she made David promise to check in with her regularly and to abandon the plan immediately if it became dangerous. As David prepared for his undercover experiment, he had no idea that what he would discover would fundamentally change not just his understanding of his company, but his entire approach to leadership and business. The comfortable assumptions he had built his success on were about to be shattered, and the real education of David Thompson was about to begin. 2 weeks later, Daniel Rodriguez walked through the employee entrance of Phoenix Industries' downtown facility, his hands shaking slightly as he swiped the temporary ID card that identified him as a new night shift cleaner. David Thompson had ceased to exist for the next 14 days. He had traded his hand-tailored suits for a uniform shirt that smelled like industrial detergent and work boots that already felt uncomfortable on his feet. The transformation had taken more effort than he expected. Patricia had helped him create a complete backstory, including references from previous cleaning jobs at companies that had agreed to verify his employment if anyone called. He had practiced speaking with a slight accent, and had even gotten a temporary tattoo to make himself less recognizable. Most importantly, he had spent hours studying how to operate industrial cleaning equipment so he wouldn't immediately expose himself as a fraud. His supervisor for the night was a woman named Betty who looked to be in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that suggested she had seen everything the job could throw at her. She barely looked up from her clipboard when he introduced himself. "You're the new guy, right? Daniel?" she asked, checking his name off a list. "Ever done commercial cleaning before?" David nodded, trying to sound confident. "Yes, ma'am. A few years at different places. Betty handed him a cart loaded with supplies and a list of offices to clean. Building C, floors 12 through 15. Bathrooms, offices, conference rooms. Don't touch anything on the desks unless it's obviously trash. Don't unplug anything electronic. If you break something, report it immediately. Questions? David looked at the supplies on his cart and felt his first shock of the night. The cleaning chemicals were brands he didn't recognize, stored in unmarked bottles that looked like they had been refilled from larger containers. The equipment was old and showed obvious signs of heavy wear. One of the vacuum cleaners had duct tape holding part of the handle together. "Is this equipment safe to use?" he asked, pointing to the damaged vacuum. Betty gave him a look that suggested this was not a question she was used to hearing. "It's what we've got. Management says it works fine, so it works fine. You got a problem with that already?" David quickly shook his head and pushed his cart toward the elevator. As the doors closed, he realized his first lesson was already becoming clear. These workers weren't given the tools they needed to do their job safely, and they weren't in a position to complain about it. The elevator ride to the 12th floor gave him a few minutes to prepare mentally for what came next. He had walked through these same hallways hundreds of times during the day, but everything looked different at night. The polished marble floors that gleamed during business hours showed scuff marks and wear patterns that were hidden by the constant flow of daytime foot traffic. Burnt-out light bulbs that he had never noticed during the day cast long shadows in the corridors. David started with the bathrooms, a task that immediately humbled him in ways he hadn't expected. The physical work was harder than anything he had done in years. His soft executive hands, accustomed to nothing more strenuous than signing documents, began to blister within the first hour from scrubbing toilets and sinks. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to what he discovered about the cleaning supplies he had been given. The bathroom cleaner burned his skin on contact, leaving red marks on his hands that itched and stung. When he tried to find rubber gloves in his cart, he discovered there was only one pair, and they had several holes that rendered them useless. He went back to find Betty and asked about getting proper protective equipment. She was mopping near the elevator bank and looked annoyed by the interruption. "Gloves are supposed to last 2 weeks," she told him. "If you go through them faster than that, it comes out of your paycheck. Same with the cleaning solution. You use what you're given and you make it last." David stared at her, trying to process what he was hearing. "But this stuff is burning my hands." "Isn't there something safer we can use?" Betty stopped mopping and looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. "Look, new guy, I can see you're not used to this kind of work. But this is the job. Management buys the cheapest supplies they can find, and we use what we're given. You complain too much and they'll find someone else who won't complain at all. There's always someone else who needs the job more than you do." As the night progressed, David began to understand the full scope of what his employees were dealing with. The cleaning chemicals weren't just cheap. They were potentially dangerous. The equipment was maintained poorly, if at all. The vacuum cleaner with the taped handle actually gave him a small electric shock when he plugged it in, suggesting a serious safety hazard that no one had bothered to address. But the physical challenges were only part of the story. Around midnight, as David was cleaning offices on the 14th floor, he encountered his first group of day shift managers who were working late. He recognized them immediately as department heads from the marketing division, people he had spoken with in meetings dozens of times. What he witnessed over the next hour shocked him more than anything he had experienced so far that night. These managers, whom he had always considered professional and respectful, treated the cleaning staff as if they were completely invisible. They walked through freshly mopped areas without acknowledgement, leaving muddy footprints that David had to clean again. When one of them spilled coffee on a conference table, he simply left it there, apparently assuming someone else would clean it up. The worst incident came when David was emptying trash cans in the marketing director's office. The director, Tom Wilson, was on a conference call and became agitated when he saw David working nearby. "Can you come back later?" Tom snapped, covering the phone with his hand. "I'm trying to conduct business here." David apologized and started to leave, but Tom wasn't finished. "And next time, try to be quieter. Some of us are trying to do important work." David had sat in meetings with Tom Wilson dozens of times. He had approved Tom's salary increases and bonuses. He had celebrated Tom's successes and supported him through difficult projects. But Tom looked at him now with the same indifference he might show to a piece of furniture, never once recognizing the man who had hired him 5 years earlier. As David moved through the building that first night, he began to notice things that had been completely invisible to him during his daytime visits. Water stains on the ceiling that suggested leaking pipes, electrical outlets that sparked when equipment was plugged in, carpets that were worn through in places, creating trip hazards that could easily cause injuries. He also began to understand the impossible expectations placed on the cleaning staff. Betty had given him a list of tasks that would have been challenging to complete with proper equipment and adequate time. With broken vacuum cleaners, caustic cleaning chemicals, and no protective gear, the work became not just difficult but potentially dangerous. Around 3 a.m, David encountered another cleaner named Antonio, who had been working at Phoenix Industries for 7 years. Antonio was cleaning the executive conference room where David had conducted board meetings just the week before. "New guy, right?" Antonio asked, looking up from polishing the massive conference table. "How you liking it so far?" David decided to test the waters. "It's tougher than I expected. Some of this equipment seems pretty worn out." Antonio laughed bitterly. "Worn out? That's one way to put it. See this vacuum?" He pointed to a machine that looked even worse than the one David had been using. "Been making that grinding noise for 6 months. Every time someone reports it, maintenance says they'll look into it. Never happens. What about the safety issues? The chemical burns, the electrical problems?" Antonio's expression became more serious, and he looked around to make sure no one else was listening. "You learn to keep your mouth shut about stuff like that. Last guy who made too much noise about safety problems got laid off during the next restructuring. Pure coincidence. According to management, David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. They fired someone for reporting safety problems? Officially? No. Officially, his position was eliminated due to budget constraints. Unofficially, everyone knows what happens when you rock the boat too much. You want to keep this job, you do the work, and you don't ask too many questions. As his first shift ended and David walked to his car in the early morning light, he realized that everything he thought he knew about his company had been based on carefully curated information. The reports he received, the facility tours he took, the employee interactions he had were all designed to show him what his management team wanted him to see. The real Phoenix Industries was a place where workers were expected to risk their health and safety to complete impossible tasks with inadequate equipment. It was a place where employees were afraid to report problems because they might lose their jobs. It was a place where the cleaning staff were treated as less than human by the very managers David had hired and promoted. Driving home as the sun came up, David's hands still burning from the cleaning chemicals, he understood that his 2-week experiment was going to reveal problems far more serious than low employee satisfaction scores. He was about to uncover a systematic failure of leadership that started with him and trickled down through every level of his organization. The comfortable distance between the executive suite and the actual work of his company had allowed him to remain willfully blind to conditions that no human being should have to endure. But now that he had seen the truth, he couldn't unsee it. The question was whether he would have the courage to act on what he was learning, even if it meant admitting that his entire approach to running the company had been fundamentally wrong. As he pulled into his driveway and looked at his comfortable suburban home, David realized that his real education was just beginning. The next 13 days would force him to confront not just the failures of his company, but the failures of his own leadership that had made those conditions possible. By his 4th night as Daniel Rodriguez, David had developed a routine that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. His hands had stopped bleeding from the harsh cleaning chemicals, though they remained cracked and painful. His back ached constantly from bending over to scrub floors and empty trash cans, but the physical discomfort was becoming secondary to his growing understanding of the human cost of his company's operations. He had begun to form relationships with his fellow night shift workers, people whose names he had never known despite the fact that they had been keeping his buildings clean for years. Each conversation revealed another layer of struggle and resilience that humbled him in ways he had never expected. Betty, his supervisor, had initially seemed stern and unapproachable. But as the nights progressed, David began to understand that her tough exterior was a survival mechanism developed over 15 years of working for Phoenix Industries. During their break on Wednesday night, she finally opened up about her situation. "You got kids, Daniel?" she asked, unwrapping a sandwich that looked like it had been packed at home to save money. "No. "Ma'am," David replied, realizing how little thought he had given to his fake identity's personal life. Betty nodded and took a small bite of her sandwich, making it last. "I got a boy, 23 years old, but he's got special needs. Born with developmental delays, you know? Sweet kid, but he'll never be able to live on his own or hold down a regular job." David felt his chest tighten as Betty continued. "His dad left when Kevin was 5. Said he couldn't handle having a disabled child, so it's been just me and Kevin for 18 years now. This job, it ain't glamorous, but it's steady. Health insurance, regular hours, and they don't ask too many questions as long as the work gets done." "That must be difficult," David said, struggling to find adequate words. Betty laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Difficult doesn't begin to cover it. You know what's really difficult? Watching your supervisors treat you like you're stupid because you didn't go to college, when the truth is you never had the chance because you were too busy working 2 jobs to keep your kid fed and housed." David learned that Betty had been working double shifts regularly for the past 6 months because Phoenix Industries had laid off 3 cleaners during the last efficiency review but hadn't reduced the amount of work that needed to be done. She was doing the job of 4 people for barely more than the salary of 1, and she was grateful for the extra hours because they helped cover Kevin's medical expenses. "The day managers, they see the work getting done and they think everything's fine," Betty explained. "They don't care if I'm working 16 hours a day to make it happen. They just care that their offices are clean when they show up in the morning." Another worker who made a deep impression on David was an older man named Frank, who cleaned the manufacturing floors. Frank was 67 years old and should have been enjoying retirement, but he explained that his pension had been eliminated during a corporate restructuring 5 years earlier. 38 years I worked for this company," Frank told David as they shared a brief break in the supply closet. "Started when I was 22, right out of high school. They promised us that if we stayed loyal, worked hard, they'd take care of us in our old age." Frank showed David his hands, which were gnarled from decades of manual labor, and bore several scars from workplace accidents. "I've had 3 surgeries on these hands from injuries I got on the job. Every time the company doctor said it wasn't work-related. Every time I had to pay for the treatment myself." David discovered that Frank was working with a hernia that should have been treated months ago, but he couldn't afford the surgery on his limited salary, and the company's insurance had a deductible so high that it might as well not exist for someone in his financial situation. "You know what really gets me?" Frank continued, his voice heavy with exhaustion and frustration. "I helped train some of the guys who are now executives here. Good workers who moved up through the ranks. But they don't remember guys like me anymore. We're just overhead to them now. Line items on a budget that need to be minimized." The stories kept coming, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Carmen, a single mother of 3, explained how she had to bring her youngest daughter to work with her sometimes because she couldn't afford childcare and had no family support. The 8-year-old would sleep on a cot in the supply closet while Carmen cleaned offices, both of them hoping that no supervisor would discover the violation of company policy. "I know it's against the rules," Carmen told David, tears in her eyes. "But what choice do I have? I can't leave her home alone, and if I don't work, we don't eat. This job is all that stands between my kids and the street." David learned that Carmen was studying for her GED at night, trying to improve her prospects, but the combination of work, parenting, and studying left her exhausted and barely able to function. She had applied for the company's educational assistance program that David had proudly announced 2 years earlier, only to discover that it was only available to full-time employees, and night shift cleaners were classified as part-time, despite working 40 hours a week. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation came from a young man named Alex who had been working at Phoenix Industries for 6 months. Alex was bright and articulate with a college degree in engineering, but he explained that he had been unable to find work in his field due to a criminal record from a mistake he made as a teenager. "I got arrested for shoplifting when I was 17, Alex explained during one of their conversations. "Stupid kid stuff, you know, but it shows up on every background check. And engineering companies won't even look at my resume, so here I am, cleaning toilets with a degree in mechanical engineering." David discovered that Alex had submitted several suggestions for improving the building's mechanical systems, ideas that could have saved the company thousands of dollars in energy costs. But there was no mechanism for night shift workers to communicate with management. and his direct supervisors dismissed his ideas as presumptuous. "They tell us to do our jobs and leave the thinking to other people," Alex said bitterly. "Meanwhile, I watch them waste money on systems that don't work properly. Because no one bothers to ask the people who actually use the equipment every day." The breaking point for David came during his second week when he witnessed an incident that revealed the true callousness of his company's management structure. Carmen had been working with a severe cold for 3 days because she couldn't afford to take sick time. On Thursday night, she collapsed while mopping the cafeteria floor, running a fever that was obviously dangerously high. David immediately called for help, but the night supervisor, a man named Gary who reported to the facilities management department, was more concerned about potential liability than Carmen's well-being. Instead of calling paramedics, Gary insisted that Carmen finish her shift to avoid creating complications with overtime and scheduling. "She's fine," Gary told David when he protested. "These people are tougher than they look. If we sent someone to the hospital every time they felt a little under the weather, we'd never get any work done." David watched in horror as Carmen struggled to continue working, clearly in need of medical attention. When he suggested that someone should drive her to an emergency room, Gary laughed dismissively. "That's not our problem. These employees are responsible for their own healthcare decisions. We provide insurance, and if they choose not to use it, that's their choice." David knew that Carmen's insurance had a deductible so high that an emergency room visit would cost her more than a week's salary, money she couldn't afford when she was barely making rent and feeding her children. That night, David broke character long enough to drive Carmen to the hospital himself, telling Gary that he was taking his break. Carmen was diagnosed with pneumonia and dehydration, conditions that could have become life-threatening if left untreated. The emergency room bill would wipe out what little savings she had, but at least she would recover. As David sat in the hospital waiting room while Carmen received treatment, he realized that his company's policies were not just inefficient or poorly thought out. They were actively harming people who depended on Phoenix Industries for their survival. The human cost of his pursuit of profitability was sitting right in front of him, struggling to breathe because she couldn't afford to be sick. The next morning, as he sat in his comfortable home office reviewing the quarterly reports that had started this entire journey, David understood that every efficiency metric, every cost-saving measure, every productivity improvement had a human face attached to it. Betty working double shifts to support her disabled son, Frank working with untreated injuries because he couldn't afford retirement, Carmen risking her health because she couldn't afford to be sick. These weren't statistics or line items on a budget. They were people whose lives were being shaped by decisions made in boardrooms and executive suites by people who never had to live with the consequences of those decisions. David realized that his company's success had been built on the systematic exploitation of its most vulnerable workers, and he had been not just complicit, but actively responsible for creating the policies that made such exploitation possible. The comfortable distance between the executive suite and the factory floor had allowed him to make decisions based on financial projections rather than human impact. But now that he had seen the faces and heard the stories of the people affected by those decisions, he couldn't pretend that the human cost was someone else's responsibility. With 5 more days left in his undercover experiment, David knew that he was going to discover even more disturbing truths about his company, but he also knew that he had already seen enough to understand that fundamental changes were not just necessary, but morally imperative. The question was whether he would have the courage to make those changes, even if they challenged everything he thought he knew about running a successful business. David's final week as Daniel Rodriguez began with a revelation that shattered any remaining illusions he might have had about his company's moral foundation. He discovered that the anonymous complaint system he had implemented with such pride 2 years earlier was not only ineffective, but was actually being used to identify and silence workers who dared to speak up about problems. The discovery came accidentally during his 10th night on the job. He was cleaning the human resources department when he overheard a conversation between 2 managers who were working late to prepare for a morning meeting. One of them was Janet Morrison, his director of employee relations, whom he had personally hired and promoted based on her supposed commitment to worker advocacy. "We've got another batch of anonymous complaints from the night shift," Janet was saying to her colleague. Brad Stevens, the facilities manager. "Same old stuff. Unsafe equipment, inadequate supplies, unreasonable workloads. The usual whining. David froze in the hallway, his mop bucket suddenly feeling impossibly heavy as he strained to hear the conversation continuing in Janet's office. "Can you trace them back to specific employees?" Brad asked. "Most of them, yes. The system isn't as anonymous as employees think it is. We can usually figure out who submitted what, based on the details they provide and the timing of submissions. I've already identified 3 likely sources from this week's complaints." David felt sick as the implications became clear. The complaint system he had championed as a way to give voiceless employees a safe avenue for reporting problems was actually being used to hunt down and silence those same employees. "What's the plan for dealing with them?" Brad continued, same as always. "We'll find reasons to write them up for performance issues over the next few months. Maybe some attendance problems, quality of work concerns, that sort of thing. Build a paper trail that justifies termination if they keep causing trouble. HR approved the approach last month. Perfect. These people need to understand that making waves isn't in their best interest. We've got a good thing going with the night shift operations. Low costs, high productivity, minimal drama. The last thing we need is a bunch of troublemakers stirring things up." David had to grip the wall to steady himself as the full scope of what he was hearing sank in. His own managers were systematically identifying and targeting employees who tried to use the very reporting system he had created to protect them. Worse, they were proud of their efficiency in silencing dissent. The conversation continued, and David learned that this practice had been going on for over a year. Dozens of employees had been quietly pushed out after filing complaints about unsafe working conditions, discrimination, or other problems. The Human Resources Department, which was supposed to protect workers, had become an active participant in their persecution. "The beauty of it is that we never have to directly address their complaints," Janet was saying. "We just make their lives difficult enough that they either stop complaining or find jobs somewhere else. Either way, problem solved." David realized he was witnessing a level of institutional cruelty that went far beyond simple neglect or poor management. This was deliberate, systematic abuse of the most vulnerable people in his organization, orchestrated by people he had trusted with positions of authority. The breaking point came 2 nights later when Frank, the 67-year-old cleaner David had grown to respect and care about, collapsed while trying to move a piece of heavy equipment that should have been handled by maintenance staff. Frank had been ordered to relocate an industrial floor polisher that weighed several hundred pounds. Despite his age and previous back injuries, David was working in a nearby section when he heard Frank cry out in pain. He rushed over to find the older man lying on the floor, his face gray with agony, and his breathing shallow and rapid. It was immediately clear that Frank was in serious medical distress, possibly having suffered a heart attack or stroke. David immediately called for emergency help, but Gary, the night supervisor, arrived before the paramedics and began berating Frank for creating a scene and potentially exposing the company to liability. "Get up." "Frank," Gary demanded, standing over the clearly injured man. "You're fine. Just got the wind knocked out of you. We've got a building full of work that needs to get done, and I can't have people lying around on company time." "He needs medical attention immediately," David said, abandoning any pretense of staying in character. "This man could be having a heart attack." Gary turned on David with a furious expression. "And who asked for your opinion, new guy? Frank's been pulling this dramatic stuff for years. He knows if he creates enough of a scene, he can get out of doing the heavy work." Frank was trying to speak, but his words came out as barely coherent whispers. David knelt beside him and could see that the older man was in genuine medical crisis. His skin was clammy and cold, his pulse was weak and irregular, and he seemed to be drifting in and out of consciousness. "We need to call an ambulance right now," David said. Reaching for his phone, Gary grabbed David's arm to stop him. "Absolutely not. The last thing we need is paramedics and paperwork and insurance claims. Frank will be fine once he catches his breath. Won't you, Frank?" Frank managed to nod weakly, obviously terrified of contradicting his supervisor, even while experiencing what might be a life-threatening medical emergency. David looked around desperately for support from the other workers who had gathered, but he could see the fear in their eyes. They wanted to help Frank, but they were terrified of losing their jobs if they challenged Gary's authority. The system had trained them to prioritize their supervisor's demands over their own moral instincts and basic human compassion. "If you call for medical help without my authorization, "You're fired," Gary told David. "And Frank will be fired too for causing the disruption. Is that what you want?" The threat hung in the air as Frank continued to struggle on the floor. David realized that this was the moment that would define not just the rest of his undercover experiment, but his entire understanding of what leadership really meant. He could continue to hide behind his fake identity and watch a good man possibly die to protect corporate liability, or he could act according to his conscience regardless of the consequences. David pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "This is an emergency," he told the dispatcher, giving the building's address. "We have a 67-year-old man who appears to be having a heart attack or stroke. He needs immediate medical attention." Gary's face turned red with fury. "You just lost your job, Rodriguez. And you just cost Frank his job, too. I hope you're proud of yourself." "Then fire me," David replied, kneeling back down beside Frank and trying to keep him comfortable until help arrived. "But I'm not going to watch someone die because you're worried about paperwork." The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes and immediately confirmed that Frank was indeed having a serious cardiac event. They worked quickly to stabilize him and prepare him for transport to the hospital. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, Frank managed to grab David's hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "I thought I was going to die on this floor and nobody would care." David felt tears in his eyes as he watched the ambulance drive away. Frank might recover, but David knew that both of their jobs at Phoenix Industries were over. Gary had made it clear that calling for medical help was a fireable offense, and David had no doubt that the threat would be carried out. But the board remained skeptical. Several members threatened to call for David's removal as CEO if he didn't reverse the changes immediately. The confrontation came to a head when Richard Hawkins stood up and addressed David directly. "You've been running this company for 15 years, and you've delivered consistent profits and growth. But these changes suggest that you've lost sight of our primary responsibility, which is to our shareholders. If you can't refocus on what's really important, we'll find someone who can." David looked around the boardroom at the faces of people who had supported and trusted him for years. He knew that his next words would probably end his career as CEO of Phoenix Industries, but he also knew that he couldn't continue leading a company that treated its workers as disposable resources. "Our primary responsibility is not to shareholders," David said quietly. "Our primary responsibility is to the people who make this company possible every single day. That includes shareholders, but it also includes every person who walks through our doors to work for us. If you want to fire me for believing that, then fire me. But I won't go back to running a company that profits from human suffering." The vote was close, but David survived by a narrow margin. 3 board members resigned in protest, and Richard Hawkins made it clear that David was on probation. Any decline in profitability would result in his immediate removal. Over the next 6 months, David watched nervously as the quarterly reports came in. The increased labor costs and facility improvements had indeed impacted short-term profits. But other metrics told a more encouraging story. Employee turnover dropped from 78% to 12%. Safety incidents decreased by 85%. Customer satisfaction scores improved as product quality rose with the increased morale and stability of the workforce. More surprisingly, productivity actually increased despite the higher labor costs. Workers who felt valued and secure in their jobs were more efficient, more creative, and more committed to the company's success. Alex's engineering suggestions alone saved the company $200,000 in energy costs. Betty's improved staffing and equipment resulted in cleaner facilities and fewer complaints from daytime employees. The transformation of Phoenix Industries began, attracting attention from business media and industry analysts. David found himself invited to speak at conferences about ethical leadership and sustainable business practices. The company won several awards for workplace excellence and was recognized as one of the best places to work in their industry. But the real validation came from the people whose lives had been changed by the transformation. Frank returned to work as safety director and implemented comprehensive safety protocols that eliminated the dangerous conditions David had witnessed during his undercover experience. Betty hired adequate staff and purchased proper equipment, creating a night shift operation that actually functioned efficiently without requiring workers to sacrifice their health or dignity. Carmen flourished in her new daytime position and was able to complete her GED with the support of the company's educational program. Her children no longer had to worry about their mother bringing them to work in the middle of the night, and Carmen began taking college courses with the goal of eventually moving into management herself. 1 year after his undercover experiment, David instituted a policy requiring all senior managers to spend 1 week annually working alongside frontline employees. The policy was initially met with resistance, but it gradually created a management culture that understood and valued the contributions of every worker in the company. The financial results spoke for themselves. Despite the initial concerns about increased costs, Phoenix Industries' stock price rose steadily as investors recognized the long-term value of a stable, motivated workforce. Employee referrals became the primary source of new hires, eliminating most recruitment costs. Customer loyalty increased as product quality and service improved across all departments. 5 years later, David still spent 1 week each quarter working alongside different groups of employees throughout the company. It kept him grounded in the reality of daily operations and prevented the comfortable isolation that had allowed problems to fester for so long. The boy who had once been Daniel Rodriguez was gone, but the lessons he had learned during those 2 weeks continued to guide every decision David made as CEO. Phoenix Industries had become living proof that business success and human dignity were not mutually exclusive, and that the most sustainable profits came from companies that valued every person who contributed to their success. The comfortable distance between the corner office and the factory floor had been permanently eliminated, replaced by a management philosophy that recognized that the true measure of a company's worth was not just what it produced, but how it treated the people who made that production possible. David had learned that being a leader meant serving the people who worked for him, not the other way around. And that lesson had transformed not just his company, but his entire understanding of what business success really meant.